Hi everybody, thanks for watching this week's video. This week I wanted to give you an update on all of the things that I figured out about tiny houses. If you remember a few months ago, I think it was around January, at the end of January, I did go to the tiny house show, and that's when I got inspired for having a tiny house on my property or doing some type of a community investment into the future. So I took an online 7-day class that was put on by NOAA Certified. They're here in Florida, and what they do is they certify RVs, tiny homes, things like that. And I learned so much during the 7-day online classes, and that's exactly what I wanted, because I wanted to be able to make a determination based on things that I didn't know about in the industry in order to make a decision as to whether this was the right time for me or not to invest in either having a tiny house on my property where I could rent it out, or buying a piece of land somewhere and putting a tiny house on it and renting it out, or renting it out to tiny home people that have tiny homes. I'm going to give you some of those notes today because there's a lot of things that I learned that were super helpful during these 7-day classes, and they're probably things that you don't know about that you'd probably want to know if you were investing or thinking of investing. So these were the things that really changed my outlook about what I'm going to be doing. So I'm going to bring you all of those important facts today. So one of the things that I learned about is that building a tiny house on a foundation is pretty my first task. First, I'm going to take the seminar, learn a lot of things, because one thing that I did learn at the show, she said, never tell them the word tiny house when you're calling zoning, because it's like they fret, because some of them don't have regulations and they don't want to get caught up in all of this politics. So you just have to say it's a small house. It's a small house. So I'm going to wait for the seminar because I want to make sure that I'm writing down the verbiage that I have to use when I call them about doing all of this. So yeah, Missy's over there at the fence. So yeah, I'm excited about doing this. We'll see what happens. And you're going to come up with a lot of problems in zoning. There's certain areas in the country, certain states, certain cities, that the minute you say the word tiny house, they turn you away. They don't want to know about it. There's a lot of regulations and laws that have not been created yet, and it brings up a lot of problems because there are people that don't want those kind of homes in their community. If they have, nice looking big homes, they're really against somebody putting a small home where it's going to devalue their property. So that's some of the reasons why building a tiny house on a foundation is a problem. So if you go to zoning, you never want to say you're going to build a tiny house. I learned, these were some of the tips that they gave us, never say the word tiny house to zoning. You always say it's going to be a small house. That I have to take this course before I start, because I learned, one thing I learned from the seminar was don't tell them, don't ever say the word tiny home. Don't ever say to zoning tiny home, because they just they get crazy about things like that. I learned also is that not all tiny houses are insurable, and this is why sometimes you will go to Facebook Marketplace, at least in Florida where I live. I've seen people trying to sell tiny houses that they've made themselves. Now, the problem with something like that is, and I thought you could do this. I really thought you could do this. But the problem is when you go to insure something like that, that's going to be your main problem. Especially if your home is financed or you're trying to get financing, you are not going to be able to get financing if you don't have proper certification on this tiny home, because it's not going to be insurable. No insurance company is going to insure it unless it's been done to the specifics for the area that's going to be in, or for driving it down the road. So it's got to be done a specific way, it's got to be built a specific way, and it's got to be able to go down the road and not fall apart. So that's why it's so important. And I didn't know this years ago when I was thinking of getting something for Christian, and then I ended up getting the Airstream. I was looking at tiny homes online that people were selling locally in my area. So that was something I was considering at the time. And sometimes you'll find them for like $5,000-$10,000, pretty good sizes. But then I thought, well, how am I going to move this? And things like that came up, like, is it built right? And things like that. So I didn't want to go that route, because I saw, well, there's a difference here. This guy's selling it for 10, and then you see these other tiny houses are selling them, quality builders are selling them for 30, 50, 60, $70,000. So obviously there's a difference in craftsmanship, and I didn't want to invest in something that was not well. So here in this video, in this online class that I learned that the certification is very important. So you can build it, and what you have to do is make sure you have a certification, so that when you go to insure it, you have the certification. And what that is you have a person that's going to be certifying every step of the way that it's being built according to the standards. If you're going to drive it down the road, if you're going to put it on a trailer, or if you're going to put it on a foundation, all of this inspections are going to get done, and they're going to meet the criteria, so you can insure it and you can finance it also. Not only that, you may want to sell it down the line to somebody and finance it to them. So you want to make sure that it's also insurable, because of that reason. If you decide to sell it and somebody later on wants to buy it, in order for them to finance it, if they don't have the money, they're going to have it insured. The bank's going to require that they insure the house. So that's another thing that I learned as well. I'm reading some of my notes, that I condensed them down to a couple of sheets of paper, so that I can bring you all of this today, because there's no way that I'm going to remember all of this. So the 8.5 feet is the size that you are going to want to build if you plan on moving it constantly. And if you're going to move it rarely, you can go to a 10-foot wide. But anything bigger than that, like really the big tiny homes, you probably are not going to want to invest in a truck, because then you really have to get like a super heavy duty truck that's expensive. So your best bet, and they were telling us this, was to have a planned move. If you plan on going, like, let's say I'm going to go, I don't want to be in Florida anymore, and I bought a piece of land in, let's say, Iowa, and I want to move it there. So it's the best bet is to pay somebody to actually move it, because they're professionals. They know how to move it, and what they charge is about $2.50 a mile. So this way, you don't have to have this truck that is just sitting around. It costs you thousands of dollars, and you're just gonna have it sitting around just to be able to pull this huge tiny house, once in a blue moon. So it's not really worth the money to buy a truck like that. So it's better to just pay somebody, and you can shop around for people who will move it for you. And that's their job. A lot of people, this is what they do for a living, is they move these things for you. All right, so if you have one that it's 24 foot or less, you need a 2500 truck. Anything over that, we're talking tiny house, because tiny houses are built differently than RVs, because the materials are heavier and so and so. So if you're going to go heavier than that, you will need a dually in order to pull your tiny house. And then of course I said to you previously that if it's super big, you just want to pay somebody to do it for you. Trailers for tiny houses are specific to the construction, and the ones that are specifically made for campers are not the same frames that you want to build a tiny house on. It's totally different. There's specifics for tiny house trailers, and there's specifics for campers. So that's something I didn't know as well, and that was really helpful to know, because these are questions that you want to ask people when you are purchasing a tiny house that somebody is putting on the market. You want to ask all these questions, and you want them to verify all of this for you. You want to look at this information, and you want them to be able to show you. So these are things that you can go and research. All right, another thing that I learned was that the roof gables and the pitches are important in the design. If you are working with somebody to design the tiny house for you, those roof pitches can make a big difference as far as storage is concerned, because you can do a lot more with the storage if your pitches are right. So that was something that was interesting as well. If you're going to be using this tiny house to drive it down the road, because it's a smaller one and you plan on using it and driving it down the road, then you're going to want to go with metal roof. You cannot use shingles if you're planning on traveling with this thing down the road. Remember, it's going down the road at hurricane category speeds, right? It's going to be going fast, so you have to remember these things. They have to be able to stay on. So asphalt shingles are not going to work for you. You need to actually have these metal roofs put into your house. When they do put the metal roof, they put it on from the back to the front because they have to overlap the metal. That's something that I learned as well. You cannot build a tiny house with a flat roof. It's just going to be a problem because you're going to have water problems as a result. And it's going to make it really hard to go down the road with something like that. So there has to be some form of a pitch in the roof if you're designing it. And moisture issues are going to be your biggest problem according to what I learned. And that's why most people with tiny homes, they will have a dehumidifier inside of their homes because it's a smaller space and a lot of humidity can build up inside the house. Not all RV parks are going to allow you to bring a tiny house in there unless they are licensed as a modified trailer. So some RV parks will actually ask you several questions before they're allowed to stay on their property. So just be aware of that. It's not just that you can just pull it anywhere and just drop off like a camper. You have to call ahead and let them know you're bringing a tiny house. It's not like you're just stopping in with a camper. This is a little bit different, and they have some requirements for that. Especially if you're going to be staying in a place during the season, there may be special requirements. So make sure that you do your due diligence and call ahead to the RV park and talk to them about the situation so that they understand and they can give you the okay to bring it. You don't want to drive all of this miles to get there and then they're going to tell you no, we can't accommodate you here. All right, if the builder pays for the inspection legally belongs to the builder and he doesn't have to give it to you. So when you're building a tiny house, if you pay for the inspection belongs to you and you get to keep it. So it's important for you to know that because he doesn't have to give it to you because he paid for it. If you're going to finance a tiny home, you must put down 20% and your FICO, I think it says 680. I think it wrote 6. Yes, your minimum FICO score is a 680. So the VIN number has to be on the builder contract and on the tongue as well when you go to finance it. Now, not everybody will finance a tiny home for you. There is a place in Utah, there's a bank called Liberty Bank, and they're in Utah, and that's what they do. They mostly finance tiny homes, but they only work on a personal tiny homes. They don't do like community villages or anything like that. It's just like, you want to buy a tiny house, you want to live in it, and you go to them and then they will finance it for you, because most banks will not get involved in something like this because this is very specific, because you're constantly moving it around, and most banks like that it is real estate and it sits on the property, it's attached to the property, and because you're on wheels and you're moving it around, there's a whole bunch of different specifics on that as far as financing is concerned. So the percent is a little bit higher for financing a tiny home because they're taking more of a risk. So at the time that I saw the classes, he was talking about from 6% to 10%, depending on your credit as well, or what the situation is. But that's so you understand, and they will finance for 5, 10, 15, 20 years and so forth. So there is a possibility for you to get the same type of financing just at a higher rate than a standard home. Once you put the tiny home on a foundation, now it's considered real estate. Now your options are way bigger because more banks may be willing to finance it for you because it's attached to an actual parcel of land, whereas if it's on wheels, it's going to be way harder for you to get financing. So when I spoke to you earlier about zoning and having it on foundation, when you go inside to the zoning office, you never tell them that it's a tiny house what you're building. You're going to tell them that it's a detached accessory building is what you want to build on your land. That's the word. You do not say I want to build a tiny house. You are going to build a detached accessory dwelling unit. That is the correct wording, so that they don't get all riled up and they send you away. This is the kind of wording that you want to present to them when you go to zoning. So some of the highlights that I learned during these classes, which are really helpful. And if you're really thinking about learning about a tiny house or considering moving into a tiny house, having somebody build it for you, I would definitely recommend that you go to a tiny house show. Go online and look it up. There's tiny house shows all over the country, all over the place. You can find them and you can go inside, you can look around. It's definitely eye-opening when you go inside the homes and you see the sizes. You get to walk around the houses inside. Try to go on a day that's not a lot of people, because it makes a big difference when you have lines of people and tons of people inside. You really want to get a feel for the house and how you feel in it, if you feel spacious enough, if you feel comfortable. You want to look at storage. You want to see if you are able to put in all of the things that you need. You know, what is your routine like? What is your life like? And you want to consider also the movement of it. Are you going to be able to afford moving something like this in the future if it's needed? Now, right now, probably it's going to cost more to move a tiny house, because the price of gasoline has gone up, and thus this is why it's probably going to cost more now. But that's something that you have to consider. So for me personally, I really gave it a lot of thought. I was really inspired when I went out to do this, but I realized right now that the market is super high, and I'm afraid to invest in any piece of land at a really high price. So that's not a consideration for me at the time. Also considered building here on the property, but right now I'm really happy living just by myself here on this property, having the space, a good amount of space between my neighbors. I really feel good being spread out like this, and I don't feel that I need to right now at this point, but it's definitely something I would consider in the future, just so that I have an extra income coming in. That I'm going to have to do is, after the seminar, is actually call my county and see if it's not going to be an issue. It shouldn't be an issue because they're on wheels, so it's the same as having an RV. They're just parked here for a seasonal time. It's not they're going to be permanent. So I'm going to have to find out about, I know that I'm in agriculture. I have deed restrictions, but they're not really enforced. Some of them are not enforced. It is something that I could do. I do have to invest. Fencing I have to add, and then I would have to add kind of like a driveway for them to get up there. For me, I would have to finance it. And this is something that in the future I may do. For the next couple of months, I'm going to be holding off on that. Doesn't mean that I'm not going to be still considering and thinking about it. It's something that you don't want to jump into really quick, because I've heard people talking about how they regretted buying certain sizes, building certain ways. They knew better now, and then it's harder for them to sell it because they were trying to save some money, and then it doesn't really help later on when you try to sell it. So it's a lot of things to consider, and it's something that you just don't want to jump into, and I just don't want to jump into, especially when the market is unstable at the time. And so it's something that I plan on in the future. It's not for me. I don't think I would live in a tiny house, at least not this time in my life. Plus right now I have Christian living with me, my son. So it's something that in the future I can do, and I really do like the idea a lot. I also like the idea also of building a village and community, and I did learn of one. I think it's in Virginia they were talking about. I have the information, and they do like classes once a year. They have community classes where they show people community. There's some books that I learned about as well that are really super helpful. If you're interested about any type of information, you can contact me on my website or down in the comments, and I will give you information on a good book. I will give you information on a good village that I heard about that is super awesome, that they actually open to the public so that people could come in and learn every year. I think they do charge for that. So these are things that I think in the future I would probably like to do, is go to these villages and explore, look around, see what's going on. But for right now, I feel that the market is too overpriced. I feel that the interest rates are too overpriced. I feel that our monetary system in banking right now is very unstable, and I'm more of a play it safe type of person, and I don't want to get involved in anything like that. So I hope this video was really helpful for you. You learned a little bit of things like I did, and I do recommend taking a class like this and really being informed before you go ahead and invest so much money. Most tiny houses now, you're going to find them, they're going to be between $40,000, $50,000 to $100,000 is usually the ballpark where the prices are. So for something like that, you really have to take your time to really learn a lot about what is it that you want, the design that you want, so that you don't regret it in the future. So thanks so much for watching. I hope you like this video. If you do, please give it a thumbs up, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye. Hey, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up. Thanks for watching.